Hello, APUS and CCPUS history students. Mr. V coming to you today to talk to you about the Confederation and the Constitution, from revolution to republic. So we're going to be talking about the government that is set up during the American Revolution under the Articles of Confederation, all the way up to and through the Constitution, and kind of the reasoning behind both forms of government and the change that was necessary. So, right after the American Revolution, this is how the American colonies, now states, were looking. You had, of course, the 13 original colonies transitioning now to being states, and you can see they look very different from what they do today in certain areas. So, Massachusetts, for example, has this area up here called Maine. Maine is still going to be part of Massachusetts all the way up to 1820, which actually spawns a very controversial change, which we'll talk about here in the next unit. Vermont joins in, as you can see, in 1791, but prior to that, it's part of New York. You can see that throughout the eastern seaboard, that mostly remains the same. Virginia, of course, has West Virginia still as a part of it. That doesn't make a change until the Civil War. The two Carolinas and Georgia obviously remain the same, but you can see we also add in Kentucky and Tennessee in the 1790s, and the Mississippi Territory is added on along with the Northwest Territory after the American Revolution, when the British are supposed to at least vacate the area. This, of course, does not happen, and is one of the major things that is going to drive what eventually becomes known as the War of 1812, but that's for the next time we meet here. You will notice that Florida down here is not colored green because Florida has now transitioned back to being a Spanish territory after the American Revolution. And of course, the French still control a great deal of the territory around, along with the Spanish, when we're talking about the Mississippi River. Right now it's Spain. This is all Spain down here. But the French under Napoleon are going to change things as we progress through the French Revolution in the late 1790s and early 1800s. Again, another story for another day. And the British, of course, are still up in Canada. Again, that'll be one of the driving forces of the War of 1812. Now, of course, when all of this changes here and the American colonies become the United States of America, there are going to be some social changes that come along with it, because now we're no longer part of the British aristocracy. So what ends up happening is that the American colonies, now states, don't really care too much to adapt to a British model of social class. So there is no Earl of Connecticut. There's no Duke of New York. None of that stuff exists. They don't want landed gentry because this is something that was part of the problem with the British, is that you have, Lord North and all these other cabinet officials who are landed gentry making all these decisions within Parliament that are very upsetting to the American colonies. So they're not going to go and do the same thing over in the United States that they were so upset about in British society, if you will. So they're not going to elevate Washington. They're not going to elevate Franklin to being landed elites. Now, these people, of course, owned land. Washington is the largest landowner in Virginia, but he's not going to become the Earl of Virginia. That's not something they're willing to do. Now, keep that in mind as we progress towards the Constitution, because one of the main problems is they don't want titles. They really don't want titles. They don't want any hint of British nobility or British elite status or aristocracy, even though they eventually will have it. The argument here is that it's not just landed elite; it should be intellectual elite. This should be and this is a product of the Enlightenment. This is John Locke type philosophy. Is that we're not elite because we own things. We're elite because we can process, we can think, we can, rationalize, we can adapt and be better. So there is no class title. The only class title really is Mr. or Mrs. That's the kind of stuff where you're showing the proper, respect towards somebody, is using that type of terminology. And I know it's hard to to understand nowadays, when many of you may not call your parents' friends Mr. or Mrs., and maybe your parents are the same way with your friends. They don't worry about it so much, but this was a big deal back in that time frame. And of course, Mr. and Mrs. had nothing to do with how much money you had or how much land you owned. It was a sign of respect regardless of who you were, and it was a sign of respect for age within society. So that's the big change, if you will. There is an argument over the church and state separation. There is not going to be all that much of a difference between the church and the state within places like Massachusetts. When we talked about, the formation of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, there was a great deal of issues about how much religion could become part of the government, and how much the government could use religious teachings in their laws and their practices. There's not as much of a debate down in Virginia, and in fact, during this time period, Thomas Jefferson is very famously going to write a statute on religious freedom that is widely considered to be one of the more liberal policies out there in regards to religion, that they're actually talking about how religion should not inform and should not dictate the laws of a state. So there's not as much of an argument as you would think there would be, which goes back to that initial argument or discussion that we had about the foundation of our United States in religious teachings. Somebody like Jefferson's going to say it was nice, it was a good guideline, but it's not the rule. And that's not to say that there aren't people out there that are going to say, no, that is the rule. But for the most part, the founders are going to kind of keep mum on this and not really want to talk too much about the church within the government. The slave trade is going to be an issue. Obviously, the slavery is still an issue in most of the United States at this point. Even the states up in the north that you would think, oh, well, they don't have slaves, they still do up until this point. Many of them are going to end slavery over the next 20 or 30 years, but it's a slow process. Now, the one group that is going to really push for the end of the slave trade, and by extension slavery in general, is located in Pennsylvania, and it's the Society of Friends, better known as the Quakers. So they are going to have an argument over abolition, but it's not going to be at the level that we're going to talk about in the 1830s and 40s, and even right before the Civil War in the 1860s. And so abolition may be a topic of discussion, but it's not a major one as of yet. Women are going to, of course, argue. We talked about Abigail Adams writing Remember the Ladies to her husband. But again, this is very early in the Republic, and they're not 100% on board with women's rights at this point. Whereas John Adams may be fine with it, there are other, the vast majority of these guys are not. And of course, when we talk about civic virtue, women are kind of responsible for that over time. We're going to talk eventually about what is known as Republican motherhood. And, we're going to talk eventually about this civic virtue really coming on the backs of women, and women teaching their children the right way to act and the right way to respond and the right way to, raise their children and form an American republic. So again, all of that are, on the mind of the founders as they found this republic. Now, it starts with the state constitutions. From the moment we declare our independence, it becomes very clear that if we're going to be independent, states are going to have a pretty solid system of government, that if we're throwing the British out, we better replace it with something. And a lot of times people like John Adams are going to say, hey, we need something to fight for. We need to show the people, especially those that are undecided, hey, if we win, this is what you're getting out of this. If we win, soldiers, this is how you're going to benefit and how your families are going to benefit. So in the transition from colony to state, they realize that they have to have a written constitution. Massachusetts is the first one to develop one, and John Adams is at the forefront of this. John Adams basically utilizes a tremendous amount of Montesquieu, a tremendous amount of Locke. He borrows a great deal from Voltaire. John Adams is one of the most well-read and well-versed people in the American colonies, now states. So John Adams sets to work immediately in crafting a document that will become the example for all future documents, including the United States Constitution about a decade later. And the common features of these state constitutions, it's not hard to figure out. The common features are, hey, this is how the government's going to look. So they give a blueprint of how these branches are going to look, and most of them are going to have three branches. They're going to have a legislative, which is what is today in our national government, the Congress, the executive, which is what today is our president, and the judicial, which today at the national level is the Supreme Court. Well, these state constitutions are going to have a very similar argumentation with a governor at the top, a state legislature of some sort, and then, of course, your state judicial branch, your state courts, if you will. So all of that are going to be common features. They are going to talk about how they fit in with the federal government. So they are kind of saying in these state constitutions, there's a national level and there's a state level. And in many cases, they're setting up local levels as well. And a lot of these state constitutions, including the Massachusetts state constitution, are going to have stated rights, better known as a Bill of Rights, that inform the citizens what their rights are within the states. Now, of course, there's going to be a contentious issue later on during the Constitution, but the fight for the American Constitution, the United States Constitution. But as of right now, it seems pretty straightforward that you should set up a government. The government should, pretty much give an idea of where they fit in the grand scheme of things, and that government should guarantee rights and freedoms to their citizens. So these first state governments, when they form, are very representative of the people, but it depends on the state. Some states were a little bit more concerned about, do we turn over too much in the way of power to the locals? Do we allow everyone the right to vote? And by everyone, I mean white males. Do we allow only landowning white males? Do we allow only landowners of a certain success rate? So each state is going to have a different system, if you will, but they all pretty much have the same mentality about this, that the representation should be based upon some overarching theme of equality, or guaranteeing rights and guaranteeing freedoms within the states. Now, of course, the question then comes is, are we unified as a country? Yes, we declared independence as a group, but does that mean we're going to stick together afterwards? There are people that believe when the British are thrown out that there are 13 separate and independent states, countries, if you will. So what do we do with independence? How do we create a new government? Do we continue with the Continental Congress, or do we go our own way? Do we say, you know what, we're going to have a national entity, or are we going to just say, Massachusetts is going to deal with matters on Massachusetts alone, or are we going to worry about a national government? Now, of course, there are good signs. There are similar constitutions amongst the states. It helps that Adams, and quite honestly, John Adams does a great deal in assuring unification of these states, because when he writes the Constitution that is emulated by multiple states, if you have similar constitutions, then you have similar ideologies, you have similar principles, you have similar goals. So it does go a long way to creating similar governments, and by extension, a unification of purpose. Okay. You also have political inheritance from Britain and colonial times, where everybody has a common history. Everybody knows what the British system was, and there are remnants. As much as they don't want to admit it, there are remnants within that. It's not surprisingly that many of the Bill of Rights are part of the British Constitution, which isn't really written. This is the problem with the British Constitution. The English Constitution is just kind of a set of documents in total. And there's no real, it's not like our Constitution where everything is assembled in one very easy to distinguish document. It's kind of a hodgepodge of different documents from years and years and years. But there is an inheritance of that, and we do kind of normalize it in a way. And of course, we have leadership. It helps that we have a victorious general in Washington who, during this time period, becomes America's Cincinnatus. The story of Cincinnatus is quite simple. Cincinnatus was a Roman general who, when Rome was threatened from the outside by a barbarian horde that was going to come in and basically crush the Roman Republic, Cincinnatus was a general who was called out of retirement into service, and he basically saved the Republic. And when he saved the Republic, everybody wanted to crown him emperor, and Cincinnatus instead said, I am a farmer, and I'm going to go back and become a farmer. So they offer him the entire Republic, and he said, I didn't fight to be emperor, I fought for a republic, for a representative government of the people. So when Cincinnatus turns that down, it becomes kind of a story of principled leadership. It becomes something that a lot of the founders would have been able to recite. This was something that was very common and we talked about Republican motherhood, that mothers would kind of tell this story to their children. So it was pretty ingrained within the culture. And Washington certainly would have known about Cincinnatus and been able to quote the story. But he does the same thing. He walks into the Continental Congress at the end of the American Revolution. He is basically offered the keys to the kingdom, so to speak, but instead he puts his sword on the table and retires back to Mount Vernon to become a farmer. This, of course, makes him even more popular amongst his countrymen because he gives up all the power. Even King George III is going to say that if he had done this, if he turned this down, then he is by far the greatest man in the world. I'm paraphrasing basically, but that's kind of the veneration that even King George III has, because he can't believe somebody like Washington could win the revolution and basically say, I don't want the leadership. What's funny is by doing that, Americans want him in the leadership even more than before. Now, of course, that's all good and fine, but there are bad signs too. When the British basically leave, there is a contention, or there is, I guess, a group in Great Britain that thinks, all right, well, why don't we just let them go? Why don't we let them, kind of go off on their own as an individual republic and fail? There's this feeling like if they release the states to become their own country, that they'll fail so badly that they'll actually turn around and ask to be readmitted to the British as colonies again. There is that feeling because, again, we are surrounded by French and Spanish influence, and there's no guarantee that our economy is going to be okay, and there's certainly no guarantee that we're going to stay together as a country because the common cause was gone. We were no longer fighting the same revolution. So there is that feeling that maybe, just maybe, without that outside influence, we crumble. British economic competition, and this ended up being true, is very staunch. We are very, we are not set up to be an individual and independent country economically. We've been dependent upon the British for so long, and the British have basically made us second-class citizens economically for so long that there's not much we can do. So the British economic competition is certainly going to hinder us because mercantilism has definitely put a huge problem out there for the colonies, now states. And of course, state government strength, they're untested. We don't know if this is really going to work. So, of course, when the Confederation, kind of forms under the Second Continental Congress, there really is no authority granted to this Congress, the Continental Congress, to form a national government. None of these colonies, now states, have said, they get granted the Continental Congress the right to, find independence, to declare independence, but none of them said, oh, hey, and while you're there, create a new government. So many of these states kind of thought, hey, we've got sovereign statehood. We are, Massachusetts, Maryland, Virginia, Georgia, you name it, that we are kind of on our own. And they had already been prosecuting a war without a national government. They had coined money, they had raised armies and navies and instituted tariffs. But yet again, the Confederation of the Congress actually allowed for that to get done. And the argument that you get from somebody like Adams or Jefferson or Franklin is that the Continental Congress, while they didn't really have authority to create a national government, they were given authority to create a national army. They were given authority to be diplomats, send diplomats to France in the form of people like Franklin. They had done everything that a national government would have done, and they did it collectively. So there is some precedent there that the national government handled these things. So not surprisingly, by 1777, they had come up with an Articles of Confederation that, hey, if we're going to hang together as a group, this is how we're going to do it. And it's ratified in 1781. Now, the late addition, or the late ratification, came because Maryland, and a few other states for that matter, were a little wary about having a national government. But they started realizing that, hey, they better hold tight. And there was this fear that, okay, Maryland says, no, we're not going to do it. Well, what happens to Maryland if 12 states say yes and Maryland is on its own? Maryland's right in the middle of the map. They're surrounded by the United States of America. And are they really going to be able to compete with 12 other states on their own? And the answer is probably not. So this becomes an issue as we move forward. And of course, states had to surrender Western claims to the national government under the Articles of Confederation, which is very controversial. If you remember Virginia, states like Massachusetts, they had huge land acquisitions or land claims. In fact, that's, if you remember, that's what actually started the French and Indian War, was Washington going out to lay claim to Virginia's claim of the Ohio Territory. So they were going out towards the Ohio River, places that are what is today Pittsburgh and all the way down to what is today Cincinnati, and concerning themselves with the settlement of that territory as if it was part of Virginia. Well, now Virginia has to cede that claim to the American government, which is not exactly popular, especially with the landowners. But it's something that needs to happen moving forward. Now, the Articles of Confederation, and I know this is a jumbled slide here, but the Articles of Confederation structure was indeed a confederation, and a confederation is just a loose association of member states, and in this case, a firm league of friendship, that they kind of got along, that this is something that they do as a group. They've formed together to handle their economic issues, their political issues, if you will, as a group of friends. But what is the concern? Firm league of friendship doesn't mean that they're truly unified. Friends can turn on each other. Friends can decide, you know what, that's not how we're going to operate in this. So there is some issue with the even formation of a confederation because it's way too loose. If you want to see a confederacy that also doesn't make it, during the Civil War, the South is a confederacy. And when we talk about the Civil War, the Confederate States of America don't hold together as well as they need to prosecute the war. And that's kind of the issue with the Confederation, the idea of a confederation. You don't really have the same, firm footing as a nation that is under a constitution where everybody is subservient to it. Because one of the things about the Constitution that we'll learn is that there's a supremacy clause that makes it very clear that the national government is truly in charge, especially on diplomacy and economic matters, not to mention military matters as well. The problem here is, of course, they continue the model of the Continental Congress from the American Revolution. They continue that in a unicameral, which means one house Congress, where all states have just one vote. There is no executive or judicial branches in this, so they're completely dependent upon a legislative branch. Now, of course, do they have powers? They have the power to declare war. They have the power to declare peace. So not only did they really declare the American Revolution, they also declared peace as well from the American Revolution. They prosecuted the war, and they declared peace in the Treaty of Paris in 1783. They send and receive ambassadors. People like Jefferson and Adams are going to be sent by this Congress over to places like France and England in order to become diplomats. They make treaties with other countries. As I mentioned before, the Treaty of Paris. They borrow money. We borrow a truckload of money from the French and really kind of become indebted to the French government because of that, which is going to be an issue later on, especially under Napoleon. They set up monetary systems, which, again, needed to be done at the national level. They needed to have a money system that was set up specifically to take care of issues. They established post offices. They built a navy, not a very good one, but they built it. They can raise an army via the states, which is a key wording there, that the states are still responsible for supplying the troops. This is going to become very controversial later on. We'll get to that here in a bit. They can settle disputes between the states, but there's some limitations about that, and they fix standards of weights and measures. Now, the state obligations is they had to allow open trade and travel, which many of the states were in violation of during the Confederation. They had to guarantee the equality of citizenry, which becomes an issue because, yes, the citizens are equal, but how do you define citizens? Some states are going to be a little too liberal in that definition, and other states are going to be very specific. They're going to provide funds and troops for Congress, which again becomes an issue because how much is the obligation? Do you have to provide everything that the Congress wants, or just a small little bit? And then you give full faith and credit to the states, which again, there's going to be some state rivalries that the Confederation Congress cannot settle. The weaknesses are pretty obvious. There's no power to tax. They're dependent upon states for loans, which becomes an issue. How do you create an army if you can't pay them? How do you create a navy if you can't buy the boats? How do you basically take care of any of this without money? So the national government's inability to tax is going to be a very, very large hindrance to this government. There's no power to regulate interstate and foreign commerce, which is another word for trade, which becomes a problem. There's no court system at the national level. If you want to pass a law, you have to get 9 of the 13 states to pass it. So it's not even just a simple majority. You have to have a super majority, if you will. And then if you wanted to amend the document, you need to get all 13 states to say, yep, we're going to change it. And if they add states, it's going to have to be unanimous even after that. Well, how do you get 13 states to agree to any change? It would have to be a very egregious change. It would have to be something that everybody was upset about. But if you remember, it wasn't easy for 13 states, the colonies, if you will, during the American Revolution, even to declare independence, which most of them, they were already fighting a war and they were still haggling over whether or not they should be an independent country. So they were willing to fight the British, but they were not willing to put it on paper in the Declaration of Independence without a tremendous amount of diplomacy on the part of people like Jefferson and Adams. So again, amendments, you'd have to have something where everybody was upset, and it's very difficult for that to occur. Okay. Then, of course, there's no executive branch, so there's no one person that's really in charge of everything. And then, of course, each state only has one vote, and this becomes an issue because how do you have a state like Virginia, who has the largest population, have the same voting power in Congress as New Hampshire, which has one of the smallest of all of the states? So again, this becomes an issue because is this Congress going to be based upon equality of the states, or is it going to be based on based upon the population of these states? Which means a unicameral Congress of one vote per state is not really okay. It's not something that these founders really intended. The overall effect of the Articles of Confederation is that this is doomed to fail over time. This is not going to hold up for a tremendous amount of time past the American Revolution, meaning while the American Revolution is being prosecuted from 1777 to 1783 under the Articles are not going to be a system of government that's going to survive much longer. And keep in mind, the Revolution ends in 83, and the Constitution comes into existence in 89. So the Confederation only lasts about 6 years after the American Revolution. Now, of course, the Articles, again, have some good things during it. They organize the Western land sales. They put it into a grid system called townships. So, for example, Coleraine Township, Liberty Township, any of the townships, Green Township, all these townships around here were organized under this land ordinance of 1785 of the Western land sales from what used to be the land that was claimed by places like Virginia. So they organize the land that the government has. And of course, they try and also put into place where public schools are attempted in those areas. They basically say once the land is sold, part of these land sales had to be set aside for the establishment of schooling, which is why you have random placement of universities and colleges all throughout the region. If you haven't noticed, in Ohio, we have a tremendous amount of colleges. We have an inordinate amount of universities all throughout Ohio, and it's because the territory was settled with the idea that we were going to place a university every so often in these townships. So Miami University, which, again, it's a fairly large university out in the middle of nowhere, no offense to Oxford, Ohio, but it's not exactly a metropolis. Or Ohio University, which is in Athens. Again, no offense to Athens, but without the college, it's a small podunk town out in southeast Ohio. Those colleges are set up specifically because of the land ordinance of 1785, as is, for that matter, UC, because at the time, Losantiville, which eventually becomes Cincinnati, is not going to be, it's not destined to be the city that it is today. But again, when we set up these areas, and the land starts to get sold, the land ordinance of 1785 made it very clear that we had to have colleges and universities out here for the betterment of the people. The Northwest Ordinance is going to take it a step farther. It's going to set up the process of statehood. It's also going to say that these 5 states here, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota is part of the Northwest Ordinance. So technically you say 6 states are actually formed out of the Northwest Ordinance, but these states are formed with a pretty clear idea that they're going to form up and have a process of becoming a state. So the process of growing from a territory into statehood is set up by the Northwest Ordinance. One of the things that is going to be very controversial about the Northwest Ordinance is they made it clear that any state that came out of that territory could not have slavery. So there were slaves in places like Ohio and Illinois at the time, but once they declared statehood, that the slavery could no longer exist. So by doing so, it sets a precedent within the government that statehood also meant that slavery no longer exists. Now that becomes an issue later on, and we'll get to that. But this is a good thing the Articles did. It set a pretty decent standard. So Northwest Ordinance is by far a good thing. It did avoid a civil war of East versus West. The 13 original colonies versus the frontier as well, which was a concern. Because remember, during the colonial times, whether it be Bacon's Rebellion, whether it be the Paxton Boys or any of these other rebellions, the Regulator Movement, all of them were Western frontier farmers who were upset at the Eastern elites. Well, there was still that concern at this time period that the Eastern elites were basically being, they were kind of doing their own thing and forgetting about the Western territories. And this is a concern because the British are still out on the Western territories, and you have the influence of the Spanish and the French as well. So the good is that it does avoid, indeed, a civil war between those areas. And as you saw in the initial slide, they did manage to get the process started for places like Kentucky and Tennessee to become states, along with Vermont. The bad, the British issues continue. The trade is limited. The navigation acts are not rescinded. So the British are really making it difficult for the American merchants to make a pretty decent amount of money. So our new nation starts off in some pretty severe debt. The British influence, of course, is along the Vermont and Maine border. Canada is an issue. And of course, they're still trading with the natives there who are still itching for a fight over that territory. So remember, the natives were still thinking the proclamation line of 1763 guaranteed them the Western territory. So as the expansion starts happening to the west, we are having native issues all along the frontier. And of course, there's some international issues with Spain, Florida, and the Mississippi River to the south. France wants their debt repaid fairly quickly, especially as they start to descend into their own revolution in the late 1780s. North Africa, we have some pirate issues. We'll talk more about that during Jefferson's time of office. And then John Jay, the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, actually hoped that this would influence the formation of a new government. He was actually kind of hoping that the Confederation would be kind of taken away and that they would come up with eventually a constitution that would form a government that had a little bit more legitimacy, because he was struggling in places like France and England to establish good diplomatic relations. So John Jay, who's going to become very important later on here, is really kind of hoping for a peaceful transition to another form of government because he knows this one is just not working. Now, of course, the ugly of the Articles of Confederation is that it allows for anarchy to take place. States controlling their own money and armies is not a good idea because you could, if you have a border dispute between Connecticut and Massachusetts, it could end up in armed conflict. And this is something that is threatened numerous times throughout the original 13 states. And border disputes are going to grow. Some of the border disputes are still present in places like New York and New Jersey, who have been fighting over their borders since formation as colonies way back in the 1600s. But they're not the only ones. There are questions about where these state borders are, and they will continue to fight this, which is a dangerous situation when each state has their own individual militias and armies. Shays' Rebellion is the culmination of that, where Captain Daniel Shays, who is a Revolutionary War hero, demands basically paper money, less taxation, and an end to foreclosure on the western frontier. Again, this is another situation where the West feels like the East is not listening to them. And they attack the federal arsenal and threaten government officials on the western side of Massachusetts and basically threaten to march on Boston to kind of get their way, if you will. And the wealthy finally hire an army to suppress the rebellion. But the question here is that Massachusetts, when they call out the militia, they realize the militia is composed mostly of Daniel Shays and his followers. So imagine the concern you would have if you were a Massachusetts official when you say, get the army, and you realize that the army is the one that's rebelling against you, that the guns that are aimed at you are the actual people that should be defending you. So when they ask the American Congress, the Confederation Congress, for help, Confederation Congress basically looks at them and says, hey, we don't have an army. There's no American army. There's nothing there that's going to protect you. There's nothing there that's going to come to your aid. And if it wasn't for wealthy people in Massachusetts basically paying for militias in Connecticut, Rhode Island, and other places to show up and save the day, the Massachusetts and their state assembly could have actually fallen apart. Now, the results, of course, they realize that civic virtue is not enough to run a government. It's not enough to teach your kids American policies of representative government and, freedom for all. There has to be more than that. And a reform of the Articles was called for in Philadelphia. The impact by 1789, the issues that led to Shays' Rebellion were mostly resolved. However, the question still lingers, do we need a stronger and a more central government? Now, of course, the convention is initially, that is called before Shays' Rebellion, is something called the Annapolis Convention of 1786, where they basically get together to decide whether or not the current government is working. It falls apart, but it sets the stage for the actual convention in Philadelphia in 1787. This was the work of a young guy named Alexander Hamilton. This is the first real time that he comes on a national stage and kind of makes an impact. By calling the Annapolis Convention, which doesn't really solve anything in 1786, it lays the groundwork that you could at least question whether or not the Confederation was working. Were the Articles of Confederation a document and a government that was working? When Shays' Rebellion happens, it becomes fairly obvious that it's not. The Convention of 1787 forms with 55 delegates from 12 states. Rhode Island did not show up. Rhode Island felt like you could not amend the Confederation. They didn't like the amendment idea. They didn't want to lose their status as one of 13. They were concerned that they would, because keep in mind, Rhode Island not only is the smallest geographically, but they are one of the smallest in population. So they kind of felt like, hey, well, let's not show up. Now, what does that immediately do? Folks, if Rhode Island doesn't show up, according to the Articles of Confederation, you cannot amend the Articles of Confederation without all 13 present and all 13 agreeing. So this immediately becomes a convention that is either going to do nothing or they're going to replace the entire government because they cannot amend the Articles of Confederation. They don't have the votes and the representation to do it. The Enlightenment ideals were stressed. It's not surprising that they used the Massachusetts Constitution as a guideline. So it's not a surprise that John Adams and his document are going to be utilized as a template, if you will. Sessions were held in secret. The only reason we know what was happening during those sessions is James Madison from Virginia decides to take some detailed notes. The description of the delegates are quite simple. They're all white landowning males. There is no female. There is no African American. There's no Native American. This is 55 white guys coming together, all of whom have at least a pretty sizable amount of property. Most of them have higher level degrees. Not all of them, but most of them do. But this is also a different group of delegates because keep in mind, during the American Revolution, during the fight for the Declaration of Independence, the leaders were Franklin, Adams, John Hancock, Thomas Jefferson. These are the big names that came out of that Continental Congress. Now, during the convention in 1787, the only one that I just mentioned that was actually there for that was Franklin. But Franklin was the oldest guy there. He was the oldest guy in 1776. He's the oldest guy again in 1787. All it means is he's just older. Now, he sleeps through most of it. He is really riddled with gout and he has issues. He's not as young as he was back in obviously 1776. He's really kind of struggling with everything during that time period. But Adams and Jefferson are over in Europe as diplomats. Hancock doesn't go. He's not elected to go. Sam Adams is not elected to go. Patrick Henry doesn't show up because he smelled a rat. He didn't like the idea that he felt this was an illegal group that was coming together to switch things. So again, this is not your same group, if you will. They're very different people that are involved in the convention. And the people that are going to take the reins, if you will, are people like Alexander Hamilton of New York and James Madison of Virginia. Those are going to be the two main players, if you will, trying to get the Constitution both written and adopted later on. And of course, again, the overall hopes of the delegates is when they show up, most of them are thinking, man, let's make some changes to the articles. They do not think they're going to tear it down. But this is, again, your example of if you're going to show up to a convention, you need to show up like Madison. Madison shows up with a blueprint on everything. He shows up with a plan. And because he shows up with a plan and he's prepared, he gets his way more than anybody else. And of course, you can see the convention here. The guy who takes center stage, if you will, and in the painting and this is, of course, not an accurate painting by any stretch, but this is the one that, of course, hangs in the Capitol Rotunda. You can see Franklin here in the middle. The guy talking over his shoulder is Alexander Hamilton. James Madison is seated off to the side here. And then the other known name here would be George Washington here. George Washington ends up becoming the president of the convention. He's basically put up there because, again, he's America's Cincinnatus, even though Washington, again, doesn't want to be the guy in charge. And even though this picture makes it look like he's standing up making a speech and that he's controlling floor debate, he actually sat in his chair and allowed other people to do it for him because he did not like, A, he didn't like to talk, and B, he really didn't want to be in charge of the meeting. He only did it because he was basically told by Hamilton, hey, if you don't do it, we're going to have some serious problems. So he did it out of necessity and out of responsibility more than anything else. So, of course, all of this comes down to, how do we get a document out of this? Now, the plans, of course, the Articles of Confederation are scrapped. Madison walks in with a Virginia plan that basically is this idea that we're going to have a bicameral, which means two-house Congress. We call that today the House of Representatives and the Senate. So he comes in with the idea that we're going to have two houses in Congress and that both of them are going to be based upon representation or based upon population for their representation, which of course means that Virginia and other states like New York and Pennsylvania will have the largest contingent, along with Massachusetts, of representatives, but that other states will have some issues there. And of course, Rhode Island would be one of them. They were right to stay away from this because they were worried that somebody like Madison would walk in and say, hey, we're tired of getting outvoted by smaller states. Now, New Jersey puts out their own plan by William Patterson, and William Patterson of New Jersey basically says, hey, what we've been doing is not bad. We can have one vote per state in a unicameral Congress. The difference is we have to give more powers to that Congress. Now, of course, after a boatload of debate, a guy named Roger Sherman offers up a compromise in which basically, and this is a very, very simplistic version of it, the lower house, the House of Representatives, will be based upon population. So states like Virginia would be, very powerful in that level of Congress, but that the Senate would have two votes per state. So that would still be based on equality. So that would basically allow for states that usually get outvoted because of higher represented states. That would at least equal things out. And this still happens to this day. If you've been paying attention to modern politics here, in the House of Representatives, the most represented state is California. They have 53 representatives in Congress. But the Senate, California only has two, which, of course, so does Wyoming, so does Idaho, so does South Dakota. These very small states in population, even though they got tremendous land, their population is very small comparative to California. So, of course, a lot of Californians really hate the fact that the House of Representatives will pass a resolution or pass a bill, but then the Senate will kill it. And they'll say, well, wait a minute, how is it that this small population state like Wyoming has the same voting power as California? Well, that's how it was set up from the very beginning under the Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Compromise, because Sherman was from Connecticut. They, of course, settle the election of the president. They come up with a system known as the Electoral College, which also is very controversial even up until this day, because we don't do straight popular vote. By not doing the straight popular vote, that means that the president basically during the election, as you see during the election this year in 2020, with Trump and Biden, they're not worried about the popular vote because, again, Hillary Clinton back in 2016 won the popular vote. It's the Electoral College that matters. And that was the compromise they struck in the Constitutional Convention to make sure that little states, or at least states that don't have a high population, are not forgotten. That they are not. And really what it means is, in the Electoral College, states that are 50-50 splits between the political parties, which, again, at this point, they didn't know that there were going to be political parties. You could kind of see the writing on the wall at that point, but even Hamilton wouldn't have stood there and said, oh, yeah, we're going to have a bunch of, political parties down the road, so we got to set this system up for it. But right now, it's a 50-50 split. In some states, like Ohio, we have a 50-50 Democrat-Republican split. So what does that mean? It means that in the Electoral College system, states like Ohio, and you noticed, get a tremendous amount of attention by the political campaigns. So that's why you get a bunch of Trump and Biden political ads on television during election season, because this state could go either way. Other states, like I mentioned before, California and Idaho, well, California is very Democratic. Idaho is very Republican. They don't waste their time on those states. They don't travel to those states. Trump is not going to go to a rally in California, and the same reason that Biden isn't going to go to a big old rally in Idaho. There's no point in going to those if those states really aren't in play. So there is a attention given to states that are kind of 50-50. The Three-Fifths Compromise, again, another very controversial compromise. Once they decided that, hey, the House of Representatives is going to be based upon population of the states, well, do slaves count within the population of those states? Because that is a big difference between a South Carolina population without slaves and a South Carolina population that counts slaves. Because there were certain areas of South Carolina that had, almost 5-to-1 ratio of slave to white landowners. So you're talking about a very large population that could maybe not be counted. So the Three-Fifths Compromise came up with a solution to this, because the people that were against slavery said, well, if you're going to count them for population, if you're going to count them for representation, then you've got to count them for taxation too. Well, of course, the Southern delegates did not want to pay for their slaves either, because remember, slaves don't get taxed. It's the slave owner that gets taxed. So you're talking about a higher tax being placed on slave owners. So the Three-Fifths Compromise was the idea that they were going to count every slave as 3/5 of a person. For every 5 slaves, 3 of whom would be counted for both population, for representation and for taxation, which led to an unintended consequence, because this, of course, fuels the idea that a slave is not a full human being. This is where you get the groundworks of that racist philosophy later on. And of course, commerce and slave trade becomes an issue. Can the government rule on commerce? Can they control the trade between two states? They basically say in this, yes, they can. And they also say, you know what, in regards to slavery, we've compromised on slavery, but we're going to end any and all future slave trade issues. And what they basically say is that by 1808, so 20 years after the Constitution is ratified, after that all happens, the slave trade will end. So they basically say that you've got about 20 years to ship slaves in. After that, no more. So that becomes a compromise later on within the Constitution. That becomes an issue in 1808 as well. And we'll get to that here in a bit. Now, of course, as soon as that happens, they send it out to the states. As soon as they, vote to approve of the Constitution, the convention sends it out, and they send it out for what is known as ratification. They ask the states, now that we've done this, are you okay with this as a state? Well, of course, there are people who immediately jump on the bandwagon of no, we're not. And these people were Patrick Henry of Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death fame, Richard Henry Lee, who was the one that did, in fact, put forth the Resolution on Independence during the American Revolution, John Hancock, who was the signer of the Declaration of Independence, Sam Adams, who, of course, was the leader of the Sons of Liberty, and even Thomas Jefferson, even though he wasn't there, he would have counted as somebody that didn't particularly care for the Constitution, even though he came around to it later. These were people that feared strong central government. They felt like this had anti-democratic tendencies. They didn't like the fact that it lacked a Bill of Rights. There was no mention of God. Remember, the Declaration of Independence has 4 mentions of God, even though it's not a direct allusion to the Christian God, even though there's no direct allusion, there is none in the Constitution. So, but there are 4 mentions in the Declaration of Independence. So there are some people that really don't like that. There's denial of state powers, and there's a creation of a standing army, which is a little concerning because they don't like the idea that there's a standing army that could be used by a government at any point. Now, the Federalists are led by people like George Washington, John Jay, John Adams, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton. These folks emphasized the need for a strong national government. They were basically saying, hey, if Shays' Rebellion proved anything, it's that we need more. We need more of this, And so, not surprisingly, the strong central government mentality becomes their main mantra, if you will. And they attempted to quell fears and utilize newspapers to propagandize for the Constitution. And Madison, Jay, and Hamilton are going to collaborate in New York to write the Federalist Papers, which was a group of essays that were published under a pseudonym known as Publius. And of course, this becomes an issue later on. The Federalist Papers, this is a series that basically tries to say that the federal government isn't something to be feared, and let's explain why. Now, these essays are what eventually do lead to a ratification in New York. Now, of course, when the states start to ratify, small states ratify fairly quickly because many of them realize, hey, this might be the best we get. This might be the best deal that we have, so we better sign off early. Pennsylvania is kind of sneaky to ratify. They force people that are anti-federalists to actually sit in the convention so they can get quorum to vote. They actually tie people to desks to make sure that they can say, yep, they're present in order to vote yes, but they do it anyway. Massachusetts promises a Bill of Rights. They basically get the promise from the founders that, hey, if we're going to do this system of government, you need to write out the Bill of Rights to make sure that everybody's on the same page. So there is going to be a Bill of Rights as soon as this Constitution comes into reality, as soon as it's ratified completely. Once New Hampshire ratifies, they are the 9th state to ratify, it becomes the law, but there is still a feeling like if they don't have certain states join, then they're incomplete, if you will. And the 2 that are concerning are Virginia and New York. Nothing against North Carolina and Rhode Island, but they're not the keys to making sure that everybody's on the same page. Virginia basically is won over when Jefferson finally sways over to that side because Madison basically convinces him of it. So once Jefferson kind of signs off, it kind of trumps George Mason and Patrick Henry. And let's be honest, as soon as Massachusetts gets the Bill of Rights as a promise, they kind of join the fold. New York comes in because of the Federalist Papers. And North Carolina, even though they don't have a vote taken, they kind of just go along with it. Rhode Island actually rejects it via referendum, but then is told, hey, if you want to serve in the Congress and you want to have your representatives, then you need to follow the Constitution. So they just kind of followed it ever since. All eventually joined basically to avoid going alone against the majority because there is that fear that if you're alone in this, that you're not going to have any sort of protection against British or French or anybody else. And that is basically how we end up with a constitution. The Constitution of the United States forms and is ratified, and we have a constitutional government. Right afterwards, we hold our first presidential election, and not surprisingly, unopposed, we elect George Washington, the Cincinnatus of America, as our first president. Adams becomes the first vice president, and we seat our first Congress. Now, it's not 100% foolproof, and when you look through the Constitution, you notice they spent a great deal of time telling the Congress how they would function. The Article 1 is by far the longest article. They basically say this is how Congress is going to function. This is how these are the rights and freedoms that Congress has. These are the powers that Congress has. These are the limitations on the powers that Congress has. But after a while, they're also going to realize that, hey, we told Congress what they could and couldn't do so much, we forgot about the second and the third branches of government, the executive and the judicial branch by extension. So the executive, of course, is the president. The judicial branch, of course, is the courts. They kind of allow for some form of, they're going to allow the first seated people in those positions to figure it out. So they basically feel comfortable that, all right, the first president's going to be Washington, so we'll let him figure it out. So he becomes the precedent president. So he's going to kind of lay the groundwork of what you can and cannot do as president. And most of them feel very comfortable in this because Washington has proven time and time again that he will always kind of err on the side of caution, and he will always represent the American people. So there isn't too much concern about that. But of course, the courts, that doesn't really get resolved until John Marshall, who we'll talk about later on, especially during Jefferson's time in office, which is a lot of fun to talk about, but I've talked long enough. And again, this is how the Constitution comes into being. We'll talk about the early republic in a later video. Have a good day.